Episode 2 for the Ancient Pottery Challenge this season is this little Show Low Polychrome jar we talked about before. If you don't know what the Ancient Pottery Challenge is, I'll put a link down in the doobly-doo so you can kind of catch up on what's going on here today. In the meantime, here are the tools I'm going to use to make this little pot.
A small Pooky, a gourd scraper, a needle tool, a rib scraping tool, a polishing stone, a tape measure, my iPad, and a hot cup of tea because it's cold out here today. Making a replica pot can sometimes be a lot more challenging than just making a pot, because you need it to be not only a certain size, but also you need it to be a certain shape. And those shapes, sometimes those subtle shapes can be tough. So here's how I got in trouble right from the beginning on this project. I patted out a slab just like I always do. I pressed it into my Pooky. I pinched the sides up. I trimmed down the excess. Once I got it all trimmed, I went in there with my gourd scraper and started pressing out the sides into a nice rounded shape, because the original jar is a rounded shape. And being relatively happy with my progress so far, once I got that done, without measuring, and that's the key, I went ahead and started rolling out a coil of clay to attach to the pot. Once I had my coil, I went ahead and put it on the pot. I bonded it to the pot. I pinched it thinner. I scraped it both inside and out with the gourd scraper. Okay, I was making progress. I had a nice rounded shape, which was what I was going for. But I wasn't really thinking about the original pot. So once I was all done adding that first coil and smoothing it, I decided to measure it. Oops, I was already a ½ inch wider than I needed to be. And making it wider is actually easier than making it smaller. So I could have started over, but instead I decided to try to constrict this and bring it back to the right size. The actual size of the original pot is about 6 inches wide, diameter. And so I'm about 7 here. And why I say a ½ inch is because I want it to be 6 when it's dry, and it's going to shrink a little. So I'm shooting for about 6.5, so it'll shrink down to 6 when it's dry. So here I am doing my compression pinch, trying to bring it in, measuring some more, and then I'm doing a lot of scraping, kind of pushing it in with the scraper, trying to bring it in, kind of constricting it. So long story short, I was successful at bringing it in to get it to the right size. But it wasn't the last struggle I had with trying to replicate this ancient pot. Like I said, making a replica is a lot harder than just making a pot. So as you'll see in a little bit, I'll show you how I struggled to get the rim to an acceptable shape that is similar to the original. This is the stage at forming a small jar where you really have to focus on getting the shape right. Because once you constrict that neck a little more and put the rim on it, you're not going to get your hand down in there easily again to push it out. And so at this point, I just spend a lot of time focusing on getting the shape right and making sure that, it's pushed out in the right degree and that it has the right level of roundness. A lot of these beautiful ancient pots have very subtle curves to them. Sometimes it can be really hard to get them right. And I'm not really the best at it, but I do enjoy trying to get it. So now I'm about ready to add my rim, the final stage of building this pot. And as I've said before, the rim is really the human interface of the pot. If anybody's going to notice a flaw in your pot, it's going to be because of the rim. That's the first thing people touch, the first thing they look at. And so I spend a lot of time trying to get the shape of my rims right. And as I'm going to show you here, I wasn't super successful on this one, at least not at first. So here's a general rundown of how I do rims. First I trim them off, make sure they're at the proper height. Then I kind of eyeball them and I look at where they need filling in, adding little bits of clay to low spots, trimming down high spots, using my gourd scraper to just make sure it's all smooth inside and out. Then I use that piece of buckskin just to kind of smooth it all off, trimming it down over and over again. Sometimes I'll trim it and then I'll smooth it and then I'll trim it again. So I don't know how long I spent on this, but I bet I spent as much time on this rim as I did forming the rest of the pot. And then, of course, the final step make sure my measurements are correct because this is a replica. White Mountain redware began to be made around 1050 AD in east central Arizona and west central New Mexico. So this general type of pottery had a long history by the time Show Low Polychrome started to be made. For over 200 years, the ancestors of today's Zuni people had been making redware decorated with black mineral paint and white clay. Then, around 1300, in the far west of this region where White Mountain redware was made, several new styles began to be made as the traditional cibola designs were blended and combined with cayenne designs from far northern Arizona. These new pottery types were based on the old style, but were also something completely new. Pinedale Polychrome, Cedar Creek Polychrome, 4 Mile Polychrome, and the type I'm making here today, Show Low Polychrome, were born in this area near the Mogollon Rim and at the time around 1300 AD. These beautiful and innovative pottery styles only continued for about 100 years. Sometime between 1380 and 1400, this Mogollon Rim region was completely abandoned. Presumably, these people moved east in the direction of Zuni Pueblo. But they did not continue to make these styles of pottery in their new homes, and the tradition of making White Mountain redware died at that time.
All right, so yesterday I kind of had to stop working on this because it was Wednesday, and that's when I have my Ancient Potters Club Zoom class in the evening. And so this kind of got wrapped up and set aside until this morning. And over the night, I had time to think about it and look at the picture again of the original pot, and the rim is all wrong. It's way too curved. It's curved clear over on itself, and if you look at the original, the angle is deceiving. The angle that the picture's taken at, kind of that 3/4 looking down at it, you can't really see how much curvature it is, but I thought about it, and I think that curvature is very, very subtle, very slight. It's almost more vertical. And so I'm going to rework this rim. I'm either going to be able to shape it, or otherwise, if I can't shape what I have, I'll just cut it off and put a new one on. So it's been very, very wet and cold out here in the last day or two, and so the pot barely dried at all. It's still quite plastic. Fortunately, plastic enough that I can reshape that rim. So that's what I hope to do today, is to reshape the rim and then let this dry, because hopefully I can put some slip on this in the next couple of days if it dries out enough.
So it turned out the rim was super soft and easily reshaped. So with that done and it smoothed off, it's time for some gentle scraping and smoothing before I let it dry some more. So I'm just using that deer rib to just gently scrape the outside just to smooth it off a little bit. And then I do this self-slipping thing where I get it wet and just kind of rub it with my fingers just to get it all over smooth. And then just let it dry for the rest of the day, slowly and safely. And now we finally reached the leather hard stage, and I can start dealing with that Pooky Line. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my deer rib and I'm just going to scrape down any excess clay that's at the line. But that still leaves a pretty significant little dip right there. And so then I'm going to take little balls of damp clay and I'm just going to press them into that depression. And once I've got that all filled in, I'm going to take my deer rib and I'm going to scrape over that area so that the outside of the pot is smooth and even and consistent. You won't see any traces of that Pooky Line. And then, of course, leave it upside down to dry slowly. This step is called stone smoothing. And this is kind of the ancient equivalent of sanding your pots. If you saw my last video about how they make pottery in Mata Ortiz, Chihuahua, and they use the sandpaper to kind of smooth the pot, this gets those lumps out in a little more primitive way using a wet stone. And so I'm just going over the whole pot with the wet stone. It's like troweling concrete, pushes those bits of aggregate down deep, leaves a nice smooth, even surface ready to accept the slip. So now the pot's about ready to be slipped. I've got to plan ahead and kind of get ready to slip. So I store my slip material dry. I have to leave enough time that I can soak that slip and have it to a good, even, smooth consistency before I need to apply it. And so here I'm just adding extra slip to these containers, adding some water, and I'm just going to close it up and let these soak for a few hours before I apply them. Now this yellow and white slip both come from the Mogollon Rim where this type of pottery was made. So now that the slips have soaked for a few hours, I just need to mix them up, make sure they're smooth and there's no lumps. So I usually just take a brush and just stir it up, and I can feel if there's lumps in there. If it's too lumpy, you can pass it through a strainer, but in this case, they soaked up real good. A really good ceramic Pooky also makes a great turntable, and you can see how I can just kind of hold the brush in one place, rotate the pot in the Pooky, and get a nice parallel line around the pot, which for this design worked perfect. Now this yellow gives me good coverage, so I can usually do 1, maybe 2 coats at the most with this. But with the white, it doesn't cover so well, and so it'll take probably 2 or 3 coats. But you need to be careful, because if you get that white on too thick, it'll kind of crackle and want to come off after it's dry. So you do have to keep it thin, even if you can see through it a little bit. You see what I mean here? You see how you can see through that white slip all over the place? But this is just the first coat. Now that the pot has dried up a little more and firmed up a bit, I'm going to try polishing it. To start off with, I just run the stone over it real gently and see if the slip is sticking to it. If the slip isn't sticking, then it's okay to start polishing. If the slip is sticking, you need to let it dry a little more. And you can see here that the yellow really took the polishing well. Came out with a really nice solid yellow color. But the white, not so much. You can see through that all over the place. So I'm going to add another coat of white to it. It just wasn't ready for polishing. Needed more. And so 1 more thin coat of white, and then I have to let that sit and dry some more until it's firm, and then I'll polish that again. And now that that white clay is dried a little more, you can see that it's more opaque than it was, but it's still far from perfect. But it's always going to be that way. The white is always a little more difficult to get good coverage with. But you also have to be careful you don't put it on too thickly, because like I said, it'll want to crack and come off. So you have to kind of find that middle ground.
All right, I got sidetracked for a week or so from this project because my son and his family were visiting. So I've got this cute little grandson who is distracting me from working on pottery. Imagine that. So now they've gone home and I'm ready to get focused on getting this painted and fired. So hopefully get that all done. I've got everything I need here to get started on the painting. Got a couple of yucca brushes that I've had soaking for a bit. That'll soften the fibers up. And these are the ingredients I'm going to make the mineral paint from. I've got some ground and processed manganese, some ground and processed copper carbonate, and some ground and processed clay. So you can see here what the manganese looks like before it's ground, what the copper carbonate looks like before it's ground. I'm also going to add to that a little bit of this mesquite sap, and that is an organic binder that just makes it sticky.
So the recipe is simple. 1 scoop of copper, 1 scoop of manganese, and 1 scoop of clay. So 1 part each of those 3 ingredients. And then I add just a little bit of that mesquite sap. And if you can easily add too much, and I think I actually did here, and I'll show you that later. But because the mesquite sap isn't a powder, it's hard to measure it. And so I just take a little bit and crush it up. And then when I add the water, I just drip it off the end of my finger because it's real easy if you're pouring it out of something to get too much. So this way I can be really careful that I'm adding just the right amount of water. And then I just grind it up with a rock, making specially sure that I crush up those little bits of mesquite sap so that they'll rehydrate quickly. So figuring out where to put the top line is easy because that goes right where the 2 slips come together. For the bottom line then, I measured off of the top line. That way I had a nice even distance between the 2 lines. So I used this little piece of twine and I just cut it to the desired length. And then I just moved it to different places around the pot and put a little dot there. And then, once I had dots all the way around the bottom of the pot, I could just connect the dots. And then I had my 2 framing lines in. It was just a matter of filling in the design in between those. And as I'm painting, I'm constantly working to keep my paint at the right consistency, adding more water to it as it dries out, even adding more pigments if I start running low. You need to pay special attention that your paint is the right consistency, because that's going to make a big difference in how the painting comes out and how the paints look on the pot. So if you look at the original pot, you see those 4 dots that are repeated 4 times around the pot. And I looked at those a long time and I thought they look more like finger dots than brush dots. And so I decided to put those on with my finger. And what happened was they ended up being too big and kind of too spread apart. They took up too much space on the pot. I couldn't do 4 of them around the pot. Otherwise, it would have almost been a continuous line of dots. So I don't know if the original potter probably had smaller fingers than me, or perhaps it wasn't even a finger dot. Maybe I was completely wrong. That is the reason why I have 2 sets of dots on both sides and then 2 sets of the little lines on the rim as well, because I used my fingers and it just came out too big. Anyway, eventually I got all the white lines surrounding all the black areas, which is a lot of work, but it really makes the design pop in my opinion. So the painting took me most of this whole day. The next day, first thing in the morning, was time to fire. Today I'm firing my Show Low Polychrome pot, as well as this Tucson Polychrome pot I made, along with a couple of cover sherds that I made out of commercial micaceous clay. So the first thing to do is just to warm them up, heat them up around the fire so you can drive out any remaining moisture that's in them. In the meantime, I'm cutting all my firewood and stacking it according to size, which will make building the fire quicker and easier later on. Now it had rained the day before, and it was forecast to rain a lot the next day. So this was my one window of opportunity for getting this pot fired and this video finished this week. So that also means that the fuel I'm using, the wood, is a little damp just because it did rain yesterday, which means the fire's not going to burn quite as vigorously as it would have. Because ancient Show Low Polychrome almost never has fire clouds on it, it's important to use cover sherds to keep the fuel off the pot so you can get a realistic effect after the firing with no fire cloud. 2 of those cover sherds have not been fired yet. They're brand new and they're greenware, but I am also using them as cover sherds and firing them in the same fire. One thing I work very hard at on most firings is trying to get the fire to light all the way around at the same time. That way you get a nice even firing all the way around. And you will see in this firing that it lit on the far side from the camera first. And I worked very hard to try to get this upwind side towards the camera lit. Here I am working on it. It just wouldn't do it. Even when I got a little fire going there, the wind would just kind of draw that fire up under the pots and it wouldn't really light the fuel above it. Eventually I just had to accept that was the way it was going to burn. Alrighty, what do we got here? Mid 700s. I'd like to get hotter than that. Over here got 8, just around 800 there on that cover sherd there. So we're right in there. I'd like to get a little hotter, but it rained yesterday. The fuels all have a certain amount of moisture in them. It's gonna impede a good serious burn. Because it was threatening to rain, I kind of pushed the cool down a little too hard and raked all the coals off of these cover sherds, and they cracked. In fact, I think 3 of the 4 cover sherds cracked because they cooled down too quickly. These cover sherds are kind of experimental. I'm using this commercial micaceous clay that I get from New Mexico clay, and it works really good for making them, but I thought maybe the mica in it would act as a buffer against thermal shock. Perhaps I need to add some extra temper to it in the future. One small problem with the Show Low Polychrome jar. In a few places, that black paint didn't stick good and flaked off. I have no idea what caused it. I think it might have been too much of the organic binder, but I don't know. In the close-up shot at the end, you can see those spots. Okay, I think it came out pretty good. It has a few problems, as we've already discussed, but overall, pretty good replication. Fired nice and hard, as you can hear. It did oxidize more on this side than it did on this side, and I have no idea what would have caused that. If it was the uneven firing, because it lit on one side and then spread to the other. But from what I understand about these kind of firings, the oxidation happens very late in the firing, and so I don't think that should have affected it. But there are still many mysteries to outdoor firing that I'm trying to work out, even though I've done hundreds, possibly thousands of these. So if you have ideas on that, go ahead and leave it in the comments. I'd like to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, the next pot in the Ancient Pottery Challenge is going to be that Tularosa pot. So look forward to that in a few weeks. And in the meantime, if you haven't seen the previous pot in the Ancient Pottery Challenge, that was that Pinto Polychrome bowl. And I'll link that video up right over here. So go watch that if you haven't already seen it. Thanks for coming along with me today. I'll catch you next time.